In Ross chapter 34, we have reached the third weak verb chapter, and it has to do with verbs that are weak on the front end as one noon verbs. Remember, one noon, the number one means root letter one, so theoretically any verb that in root one position has a noon would be considered a one noon verb. So what is it that is weak about the letter noon when it is in root one position? What's weak about this consonant? And I'm going to abbreviate the word consonant with a capital C just to economize space. The problem with noon is that it suffers from the Borg problem. Remember, that's the problem of assimilation. That is, whenever I have a noon, and the noon is closing a syllable, and at the same time butting up against an adjacent consonant following the noon, then it assimilates to that consonant. Remember, assimilating means becoming like the other consonant. And once the noon assimilates to the following consonant, then this duplicate consonant, because it's now viewed as a doubled consonant, will be written one time, and we'll put a dagesh forte inside of it. And so the dagesh forte represents the assimilated noon. Let's remind ourselves from our discussion back, I believe it was chapter 9. In order to say from a king in Hebrew, we could do it in what I called the sissy way, which was to write the word min, from, and to attach it directly to the front of the word, that's the object of the preposition min, using a makaf here, min melech. But we could also write it the Marine Corps way, the harder way, where you attach the min directly to the word, and it is going to undergo the process of assimilation. Now when that happens, it's going to look like this, mim melech, with a dagesh forte right here. What does that represent? It represents min melech, where the noon is in closing position with the mem, min. That's why there is a silent shavah here in my theoretical reconstruction. And then it's butting up against another consonant that follows it, the mem. So min melech yields mim melech, because this noon assimilates and becomes another mem, and then the two mems together are written once with a dagesh forte. Another example provided by Ross is found in the verb from Nathan in the cow perfect, I gave. So what does it look like to write Nathan in the cow perfect 1CP? It's natati, natati. What am I seeing here? Well, I know that my verbal root is Nathan, to give. Nun, tav, nun. Here is the first root one nun. Here is the tav. But what I see here is that root 3 is not visible. I have the T of the 1CS personal ending. Where did the noon go? Well, this is what happened to it. I had Natan T. This is what that would have looked like. The asterisk here is simply marking a theoretical form. This doesn't really occur in Hebrew, but it's what should have occurred had none of the phonetic processes happened. Natanti then undergoes assimilation. This noon right there is closing the syllable, natan, silent shavah, and butting up against the tav, and so it's going to assimilate. So this tav gets a duplicate. The tav of t is duplicated. That's what the noon becomes. So it becomes natati, natanti, natati, and then these two tavs are written one time with a doubling dot. So the dagesh forte in natati actually represents the root 3 noon that is not visible here in the form. Okay? So that's what we're seeing. These are the sorts of problems that noons pose in the Hebrew system. Now, there's a question here that I want to ask you to think about. Where in the strong verb principal parts will this assimilation problem with root 1 noon occur? Well, wherever we have some prefix consonant, and remember we have two different types of prefixes. We either have stem prefixes, the Nifal stem gets a noon prefix, and the Hifil and Hofal stems get hey prefixes. So we could see a stem prefix or one of the nutty prefixes. Remember, the nutty prefixes are the prefixes that go with the imperfect, the vayiktals, the cohortatives, the jussives, the noon, tau, yod, aleph prefixes that mark person, gender, number. When we have prefixing of either sort, stem prefixes or nutty prefixes, when those try to close a syllable with the root 1 noon, we're going to have a problem of assimilation next to the following consonant, that second root letter, which is right behind the root 1 noon. So what I want to do is look at the principal parts chart handout with you and just get a really quick overview of where these sorts of situations happen. Where will we be finding a prefix consonant closing a syllable with root 1 and then butting up against another consonant? So let's take a look at the charts, and then we'll look at some examples of this. Here we have the principal parts chart, and I want you to focus on places where we have prefixes that close the syllable with root 1. Where do we see that happening? In the cal stem, this happens all the time with my imperfect prefixes. And remember, the Vayiktal, WCI forms, jussives, cohortatives, those all use the same prefixing system. So I'm going to have this root 1 noon problem where the noon butts up against root 2, and I'm going to have assimilation all the way throughout there. That's the only place in the imperfect or in the cal where I get it. Look at the Nifal stem. Do I see root 1 closing a syllable with the prefix? Here with the prefix noon, I definitely have that. That's why I have these silent shavas here. For the imperfect in the Nifal, I don't have that situation. But for the participle, I am going to have the root 1 with a silent shava under it, closing a syllable, butting up against the following consonant. And then I've got two infinitive absolute forms for the Nifal. The one with the noon prefix will have that situation as well. Now if you look at the PL, you're going to notice that root 1 has no prefixing in the PL perfect, and in the imperfect there's a vocal shava. In order to close a syllable with root 1, the prefix has to have a short vowel and root 1 has to have a silent shava. That's not the case in the PL imperfect and those forms built off of the imperfect. So throughout the PL, I don't have any situations where root 1 is going to have this problem. And Puwal is a mirror of the PL, just the passive counterpart, same issue. If you look at the Hithpile real quickly, notice that in the Hithpile throughout, root 1 is coming after a closed syllable, and root 1 is actually opening a syllable, not closing a syllable. So I'll never have this problem in the Hithpile either. The Hifil and Hofal, I will have this situation. Each of these has a stem prefix hey, and in each of those, root 1 is closing the syllable with that stem prefix. And so I will have a problem with root 1 noon assimilating and becoming identical to the root 2 consonant. This happens in the Hifil and Hofal perfect, and then in the imperfect I have the same situation. Root 1 is closing syllable with the imperfect nutty prefixes. Same with the Vayiktals, jussives, and cohortatives, because they're all built off of the same system of imperfect prefixes that the imperfect conjugation is built off of. The imperative, still closing the syllable. Participle, closing the syllable. And the infinitive construct and absolute are closing the syllable. So pretty much everywhere in the Hifil and Hofal, I have this problem. Okay? So just wanting to see the big picture of where in our strong verb we have this problem. Now back to our handout. I want you to note that throughout this lecture, in accordance with Ross, we're going to be using these 6 verbs to exemplify our 1 noon verbs. Nafal, to fall. Nagash, to approach. Nasa, to travel. Nasa, to lift up. These 2 verbs sound exactly the same, but they are different. Okay? Nathan, to give. And then the Hifil of Nagad, to tell or to declare. All right? So let's look first of all at the pervasive problem of root 1 noon assimilating to root 2 when some prefix consonant closes the syllable with root 1. And Ross covers these examples in several different places throughout the chapter. I'm trying to simplify Ross here for you and to give you really this problem in all of the situations that we just saw in the principal parts sheet. So let's just look at some examples of this. We notice that in the cal imperfect and those other verbal forms that use the imperfect system's prefixes, we have this issue. So the verb nafal in the cal imperfect 3ms is yipol. Yipol. What are we seeing here in yipol? Well, nafal is my verbal root, nun, pe, lamed. Notice that I'm only seeing roots 2 and 3. Root 1 is not visible except for the fact that there is a dagesh forte in the pe. That represents my missing nun. So if you look at the assimilation process here on the chart, what I've shown you here is that the form that you would have liked to have seen would have been yinpol with that nun there. But because this is the situation we're dealing with, nun closing the syllable and butting up against a root 2 consonant, it's going to assimilate and become identical to the pe. So yinpol would then become yippol, and then these two nuns are written one time as a letter with a dagesh forte, yippol. So that's he will fall. The verb nasa, to travel, in the cal imperfect 3ms is yasa, yasa. Again, there's my dagesh forte here, representing the missing nun. Okay? So this would have been yinsa, and then the nun becomes a samic, yissa, and then those two are written as one samic with the dagesh forte. He will travel. The other verb that sounds like the same one, nasa, nun, sin, aleph, he will lift up, is yasa, like this. Again, dagesh fortes in the sin, that represents the nun of nasa. It would have been yinsa, it becomes yissa, and then written one time with the dagesh forte. And then nathan, he will, in the cal imperfect 3ms, is he will give is yatain, yatain. This would have been yintain, where my 3 root letters are visible. Then the nun assimilates to a tav, yittain, and then the tav is written once with the dagesh forte, and the nun is represented by the dagesh forte here. Now, let's take a look at the next set of forms here. What I've done is just given you the third feminine singular form of the cal imperfect, just so that you can see that we're so accustomed to seeing the prefix yod in our principal parts. I wanted to remind you that you can create other forms of the imperfect without the yod. So she will fall is tipol, and it's coming from tinpol, right? Except the nun assimilates. Tinpol becomes tipol. Tinsa with nasa would become tissa, she will travel. Tinsa with the nun sin aleph becomes tissa when it assimilates, she will lift up. And then tintain assimilates the nun, becomes titain, she will give. Okay, so those are just samplings of your cal prefix forms. Take a look at the Nifal perfect 3ms. Remember, the Nifal perfect 3ms has a prefix nun. And I'll just jot down the regular verb with pakad. It would have been nifkad for the Nifal perfect, nifkad. So I see roots 1, 2, and 3, nun, kurik, silent shava under root 1. Okay? So this would have been nintan, and my nun here now will assimilate to the following tav. It would become nittan, and then I write the 2 tavs once with the dagesh forte. Now this is potentially very misleading, because this can almost look like a PL perfect here, right? A PL perfect has a kurik under root 1 and a doubling dot in root 2, but we'd have a seri here in the PL perfect. The nun you're seeing here is not the first common plural nun, and it's not the root 1 nun. This is the Nifal nun, and the doubling dot that you see represents the nun of Nathan. Okay, so that's root 1. And then 2 and 3 are next. Okay, so that's he, she, or it, or he or she was given. Now the Nifal participle looks just like the Nifal perfect, except we get the long A that's irreducibly long. It will not reduce to a vocal shava. This is my Nifal nun prefix, and my dagesh forte represents the nun of root 1 Nathan. Okay? So this would have been nintan with a long A. Assimilation happens. Nittan, then written once. So the Nifal participle Natan means given. Given. All right, the Hifil perfect. What does that look like? Well, the Hifil perfect over here, I'll jot it down for pakad, is hif keyed. Hif keyed. I get a hey prefix, I class vowel, silent shava, and then the kirik yod in the middle. This with nagad, to tell, is higged. Where's that coming from? It's coming from hinged. There's my 3 root letters of nagad. Hinged. Nun closing a syllable, butting up against the gimel, assimilates and becomes a gimel. And then the 2 gimels are written once. So hinged becomes higged. Higged, he told. The Hifil imperfect is yagid, just like over here, the Hifil imperfect of pakad is yaf keyed. Yaf keyed. It would have been yan gid. 3 root letters. The gimel causes the nun to assimilate, it becomes yag gid, and then written once with the dagesh forte, yagid. Yagid. So he will tell. And then the Hifil WCI for pakad is yaf kade. Remember, we have the kirik yod becoming a sere in some of the forms of the Hifil when there's no inflectional ending, and sere is what we get, and WCI is one of those places. So it would be va yaf kade, and here va yagade. Where's my nun? I only see roots 1 and 3 here. Well, it's the dagesh forte and the gimel. It would have been vayangade, nun assimilates, vayagade, and then written once, vayagade. The Hofals also have this Hofal prefix hey that closes the syllable with root 1. And so in pakad we would have for the Hofal perfect hofkad, hofkad, where I have a U-class, short U-class vowel, and a silent shava here. What I would get here is hun gad for nagad in the Hofal, hun gad. This is a kibbutz. I know that it's not a kametz ketuf, but it is still a short U-class vowel here. And so that's still a Hofal. Silent shava, hun gad. And again, the nun is closing the syllable with hu, hun, butting up against the consonant gimel, so it will assimilate and become another gimel, and then the 2 will be written once. So hu God, it was told. Hu God. The Hofal imperfect, you God. This almost sounds like a question and answer. Who God? You God. All right. So anyhow, you God comes from yun God, where the nun assimilates to the gimel, yug God, and we write it one time. You God. It will be told. And then the Hofal WCI or Vayiktol, Vayugad. Vayugad. That's coming from Vayun God. Vayun God. Nun assimilates to the gimel. Vayug God with a silent shava. And then that's written one time as a doubled gimel. Vayugad. And it was told. So those are your forms of the Kal, the Nifal, the Hifil, and the Hofal, where those prefixes, whether they're nutty prefixes or stem prefixes, are closing a syllable with a root 1 nun, and that nun is then immediately followed by a root 2 consonant. We get assimilation.